Hey guys, this is AF UK Tips, Customs and Reviews, and finally here is my full tutorial on a custom SH Figuarts Goku Black and Super Saiyan Rose. Okay, welcome people. I'm going to do this tutorial in the same style that I did the Yardrat Goku tutorial. If any of you have watched that, I'll kind of speak through it, show you pictures showing the process, and obviously use Super Saiyan Blue to show you how what I did with him to turn him into what I've got here. I'll also kind of go into a fair extensive view into how I went about painting the joints, successfully painting the joints. And yeah, so the base figure was obviously the Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan Goku, but it was a bootleg, like a fake one, for those of you that don't know what bootleg means. So it wasn't an official SH Figuarts, it was a fake Chinese version that I used. The bootleg was unfortunately pretty awful, like there should be a picture of it in the corner, and quite a lot of the plastic was all roughed up, and on the legs there the plastic was just a bit rough. You can see on that's one of the Super Saiyan Rose faces there was just pretty much no eye painted on. I don't know if that will focus, but the left eye was pretty much completely scratched off. There's just a little black line, and that's that. So the base figure that I used wasn't the best to begin with, but I did the best that I possibly could with the figure that I had in hand. The joints were really loose, but obviously customizing a figure to this extent kind of naturally tightens up the joints with the paint and all that. So I did all the time rings and the Potaro. If you wanted to skip doing that, I would not blame you. It would save you lots of time. It would just be painting, and if you skip the tie rings and the Potaro earrings, you could probably get this done in 2 to 3 days, like including paint drying time. So anyway, to start with, I disassembled this guy and gave it a wash to wash off the factory press of the plastic. I should have a picture showing you how I disassembled him, and yeah, after he was washed and drying. So I started with his belt. But what I did is I had a leftover belt from the original SH Figuarts Goku, and to give Goku Black a more authentic look, I didn't want to use that belt. I wanted to use the belt from the Super Saiyan Goku, and I do not recommend it. It was a pain in the ass. I had to cut bits off to make it fit. I had to heat it up and stretch it to make it fit that mold, and it was just a waste of time. So what you want to do with the belt on this one, on the bootleg, if you're doing this custom, is gently pull that off, so it's just his belt, and then with some sculpting clay, do that part there. You can fill that in, and fill that in with clay. Use a tool. I used a tool like that to smooth the clay over to get it as flat as possible once you've pushed it through the hole in the back, so it's a flat line. You can, with a little bit of water, you can smooth out your finger with your thumb to flatten it down and get it in line with the rest. And then with a sharp knife to sculpt in the lines, what I did, used one of these, like a Stanley blade, to run the knife across the lines of the belt, so it obviously runs across the clay to sculpt in the lines and to keep in with the pattern with the lines that are already in there. I completely forgot, I just kind of jumped right into it. I do have a items list of what you'll need, so if you want to pause the screen now, I should have one showing of all the equipment that you'll need to make this figure. You need individual tools, and I just, like I said, I used that. That was just from a nail filing kit, if I remember rightly. And glue sticks work well, so I say tools, but I use the tools quite lightly. Anything that kind of has a decent pointy surface but not too sharp, kind of works wonders for that type of thing. So yeah, get back into it. So that's what I unfortunately did with the belt. When you come across, obviously you want to paint that red, the same red there, and don't cut it off, just leave it on, because those two parts are glued together, and I had to cut it off, and it was just, I do not recommend doing it that way. So that's how I went about doing the belt. So once I'd finished the belt, I moved on to the wristbands, because obviously Goku Black has sleeves coming down from his shoulders like it's an undershirt, and Goku has bare arms with wristbands which are sculpted and stick out. So I used fairly rough grade, heavy grade sandpaper to sand away on the bootleg on his arms. I should have pictures showing on the screen how it ended up looking, and you'll pretty much, like, it won't do well for your fingers, the amount of sanding that's involved, but it will get the arm looking flat. As you can see from Goku Black, it actually ends up looking like sleeves where they just end and don't look like wristbands anymore. So you can do that, and then with a finer grade sandpaper after that, go over it again to further smooth down, because you might have some lines from the heavy grade sandpaper kind of like pushed into the plastic. So go over it with a finer grade to smoothen out the plastic once you've got down through to the actual skin tone, because again, my pictures should be showing you, I don't know if the actual original Yardrat, it probably is, because the colour of the plastic is probably skin tone but been painted blue. So when you get down to a certain point, as you can see in the pictures, it will go a skin tone colour on his wrists instead of the blue wristbands. Okay, after I'd sorted out the sleeves, I then moved on to sculpting the time rings, which they were a pain. It took a while to do, or took a while to get right at least, but how I went around it is I used the same kind of like paper trick that I used in the Yardrat Goku tutorial. So I cut out some paper, and obviously as thin as you can, and wrap it around his finger. That's still a little bit thicker than I would have gone, or that's still a bit thicker than I originally would have had, but once you're happy with the size, you can just take the paper off and straighten it out. So you are left with the, I can't get it undone from the roll at the minute, there you go. So you're just left with the strip of paper that was around his finger, and then you can, with some sculpting clay, get some sculpting clay, mix it together, flatten it down. You can use milliput, as you should have seen in my equipment list at the beginning. So then once you've got your clay flattened out, make sure the clay is fairly thin, because you don't want the time ring to be too bulky on his finger. And then once you have the clay quite flat, you can lie down that bit of paper, obviously on top of the clay, cut it out with a fairly sharp knife, and then gently kind of just roll it around the finger. It can be quite tricky. You want to use a tiny bit of water, like with a mix. If people say it's like 10 parts clay to 1 part water, if that tiny little ring is 10 parts clay, then 1 part water to that is going to be like moisture on your finger pretty much. So once you wrap the finger, wrap the clay around the finger and get it squished down, you can then use a tool like that with, you can dip it in water, give it like a wipe one side, a wipe another side, and then use that to smooth around the fold where the two ends of the parts of the clay meet, so the time ring ends up looking smooth and like one complete ring around his finger without a join in the middle. On my first attempt to sand down the time rings after I'd sculpted them, the clay was too brittle and they just kind of pinged off. The clay just broke apart on the finger. So what I actually did on my second attempt is, while I was sculpting, I let it dry for a little while and then added a small amount of super glue, tiny amount of super glue to the clay, and every single time ring has stayed on. As soon as I used a tiny bit of super glue on each one, they were absolutely fine. I waited a little while for the clay to dry before I put super glue on, because I didn't want the super glue to react with the clay in any way, and then maybe it might have made the clay maybe not settle underneath the dried super glue, I don't know. So I allowed the clay to dry for a little while first, and then, like I said, a small amount of super glue on, and then after that you can use fine grade sandpaper to sand down each of the time rings, get them looking nice and smooth, as you can see on Goku Black's fist there. He's got the time ring on, and yeah, so once you've sanded them down, you're obviously free to paint them at any kind of part of the process you want, and that's how I went around doing the time rings. Forgot to say, out of the time ring hands, I do have the Kung Fu grip hand, but I did not put a time ring on that one because I thought I misplaced it, and then 2 days ago I opened up my SH Figuarts Super Saiyan 3 box, and there was Goku Black's Kung Fu grip hand lying there in the box. So I do have that one, he just doesn't have the time ring on it. So once you've painted them, get a bit of sealant. If it's Mod Podge can be a bit thick, so put a bit in a pot, mix it with a tiny bit of water to kind of obviously lighten it up a little bit so it's not so heavy and goopy going onto the figure. And then yeah, watered down Mod Podge is easier to use when you're trying to seal little bits like this, or in general it is quite thick, so at the moment I always tend to water down the Mod Podge sealant before I use it. And that is pretty much, that should be your time rings sorted. Okay, so after the time rings I moved on to sculpting the Potaro earrings. I ran into the same problem as I did with the time rings. I had the first one sculpted and painted, and I don't even know if you'll be able to see it, if the camera would even pick it up, but that was my first attempt. As you can see, it's really small. I tried the first one on Goku Black's base head, and I got that far into painting it and it just pinged off. So you can see how small it is in my finger and my thumb, and now how big it's ended up on Goku and the Super Saiyan Rose heads, because with it I couldn't get it on and sand it down without it just pinging off at that size, unfortunately. So I felt like it was either make it a little bit bigger so it would actually stay on, or just not have any Potaro whatsoever, and I didn't really want to do that. I wanted it to be the full kind of Goku Black. So yeah, I ended up making it a bit bigger. By the way, for anyone watching, I'm not an expert customizer. I've only done like 3 or 4 figures before, and I just kind of, I have my own ways of doing things. I don't know if other people do things the same way, but I am definitely not an expert. I enjoy doing it, and that's all that matters. But if I've done anything wrong, or if I could be doing anything better, flag me up on it in the comments and let me know. So yeah, what I ended up doing with the Potaro, making them a little bit bigger, but as well with the same as I did with the time rings, once they're sculpted on, on the back of the ear, there'll be pictures showing you, but with a like precision end super glue applicator, again super glued each kind of part really lightly, not like a huge glob of glue, because then if the glue dries it won't fit back on the head again properly. But with the smallest little bit of super glue on the back of the ear, and every single Potaro has stayed on. So to do that I used the sculpting clay and kind of rolled up some so it's in a fairly small strip. This isn't sculpting clay, but it's a good size to kind of indicate the kind of tiny little roll of clay that I'm talking about. And then with the head, what I did is, let me find a tool so I can, what I did is got that tiny bit of roll of clay, pressed it against his ear, folded it underneath the ear and around on the back. You should have a lot of excess clay coming off the back of the ear, but you can cut that off and then press that part down into the back of the ear to actually stick the clay to the ear. And then again around the front you can use a tool to press it into the ear to make sure it's actually stuck on there. Like I said, my first problem is it just wouldn't stick, and every time I tried to paint or whatever it would just fall off. But once you have that strip on the ear, then roll up a ball of sculpting clay as big as you would like it to be. Obviously you can see right here how big I ended up making the earrings for Goku. You can always, once they've dried and if they're definitely stuck on, I sanded mine down a bit to kind of give them a better shape. You can always sand yours down much more to make them a lot smaller once they are stuck on, but I pretty much stopped there at sanding them down and thought I'll deal with how big they are. So roll up a ball of clay, use a tiny bit of water, like a tiny bit of water, to try and get rid of thumbprints, or you can use like standard light cleaning gloves and you won't get any fingerprints on the clay whatsoever, because obviously you'll have gloves over your fingers. So once you have the tiny ball, press that up against the bottom of the ear where the strip is, and then on the back gently hold on to the bottom, but then you can kind of also push the clay up on the back of the ball into the ear, and then so the clay will merge with the same clay from the strip you've put on, so everything is kind of stuck on by the back of the ear. And obviously once that's on the head, that won't be visible, so don't make it too bulky, because like I said, it won't fit back on the faces properly. But once it dries, or dries for a little while, with add a tiny bit of super glue with the applicator, just so it's like as clean as it possibly can be. And then that is how I did the Potaro. Again, you can sand them down once you're happy with the size and the shape. And then I used a I think it was like an emerald green paint and a gold to for the colouring. You can see there what colour I used. So yeah, I'm pretty sure I covered everything I went through to do the Potaro. So yeah, on to the next. Okay, so after that I then went on to painting the legs. Before you actually paint the legs, what you want to do is with some rough grade sandpaper. Again, I'll have pictures showing you, but sand down the joints on the knees. You can get the sandpaper kind of right in between there and push it side to side, and on the same on the other side, and roll it up. Fold your sandpaper so you've got a triangle, like a point, and sand these parts down as much as you can, really. And again, same thing on the back, sand those parts down so it minimises paint rub. And as you can see, I just folded the legs then, and there's no visible paint rub on the back of the knees or on the front of the knees, and I was really happy with how I ended up with it. It went through a bit of trial and error, I'll get into that soon. But yeah, so once I'd sanded down the joints on the legs, I then painted them black with the Citadel standard Abaddon black, I think it's called. And then I had a Tamashii stand. The Tamashii stands fit into the bottom of the legs perfectly. There should be a picture showing you of one of the legs drying using a Tamashii stand, and they just come in really handy. You can also just hold the stand with the leg on it to paint it, so you don't have to touch it at all, and you can do the leg all one time in one successful coat. And then yeah, so using the Citadel paints, gently watered down, so because when they're a little bit watered down, it eliminates kind of brush strokes, and it helps get even coats, and it gives it a better layer when it's finished. You know, like when paint's really thick, it gives that kind of lumpy texture to it. If you use paint watered down, give it a layer, let it dry for a little while, give it another layer, you will end up with nice smooth looking finish like that. So yeah, always water down your paints. So paint all the legs and the waist, leave those to dry, and that is pretty much those done, because the base colour is black, but the trousers, the pants are black anyway, so that's the legs painted. By the way, when you paint the joints, you want to actually paint the joints individually. Like as you can see there, you want to paint that side of the joint and then the other side of the joint. Everywhere you can see a line inside of the knee. I don't know if I can get it closer with it in focus. So there's two lines with the joint with inside the knee, and you want to paint the left hand side and the right hand side separately, so then when you move the leg and move the joint, if you paint it all at once and just throw your paintbrush in there, the paint will stick together as a solid wall, and then when you move the joint, it will split like that and pull apart the paint. So if you paint each part separately, they should be able to move together, both keeping their own layer of paint on each side. So yeah, paint each parts of the joint separately, sand them beforehand, and it's all just to eliminate paint rub once you're finished. After doing the legs, I painted the body black, which is the base colour, so paint the whole thing black first, and then same as the legs, the sleeves, the middle part, and yeah, both sleeves and the middle part are supposed to be black, so a couple thin layers and you'll be alright to move on, and obviously once that dries you'll be ready to paint the shirt grey. I used a Citadel Dawnstone paint. It was like just seemed to be a perfect grey for Goku Black. So I've got to say, once you give the top half the base coat, you want to sand down the joints on the front and the back, on the front and the back of the elbows, so that eliminates paint rub. Sand them down as much as you can, and then when you come to painting, again, same as the knees, paint each part of the joint individually, because there's two bits there, and as you move the arm up and down, the joints inside twist like that. So if you just put one layer of paint over the top, then when they twist, it's going to pull the paint off of each part of the joint. If you paint it separately, then when it twists, each part of the joint has its own paint on, so it should hopefully not rub each other off as it rotates around. Same on the back of the elbows, because you can see the back of the arm comes up against that part and rubs against the elbow, so you want to sand that down as much as possible before you paint it, and again, paint that separately to the rest. So do paint that part and then that part and then the wrist part of the shirt too, just all to hopefully eliminate paint rub and get the finished custom looking as clean as possible. So once the top half is painted black, I moved on to doing the shirt in grey. And as I was saying before, I used a Dawnstone colour. It was like a perfect grey with Citadel paint. Perfect grey for Goku Black shirt. I used a little bit of masking tape on the shoulders to stop it bleeding, but with masking tape I didn't press down too hard because I didn't want the tape to stick to what paint was already on there and then lift that off when I took it off. So there's no point in using masking tape if you're going to have to repaint what you're putting it onto underneath. So that's fairly straightforward. Again, use watered down paint so you get a nice even look. There's not really any brush strokes or anything. You can see everything looks quite even, apart from if there's any rough parts, like you can see up there on the sleeve, it looks a bit dodgy. Unfortunately, that was down to the actual bootleg, not the custom. So yeah, once the shirt is dry, you can then move on to the next step. Right, so that should essentially be Goku Black painted, but far from finished with the joints, depending on what your paint rub situation is like. So I went quite far into this. What I ended up doing, every time I was finished with painting the joints, I would wait for them to completely dry and then straight away pick them up and move them again. And that way, from moving them straight away, you can locate where the paint on the joint is still rubbing. I'll have pictures showing kind of what I did. So I painted it, moved it, the paint will rub off as you move the joint, but where the paint rubs off shows you where to then carry on sanding down the joint even more. And you can just go through the process of painting a joint, then moving it around, seeing where it rubs off, sanding down the joint, repainting the joint. Once it's dry, moving it around. If there's any more paint rub, do the same thing. It will show you where the paint's rubbing off, so that's where you know how to sand down. You can see through the pictures kind of how bad the paint rub was on the arms, and now you've seen through this tutorial of me moving his arms around, and there's very minimal paint rub. There's a tiny bit up there, that was the worst part for it, but on the back there, as you can see, I've moved him around so many times, there's no paint rub on there. And the joints on the front of the elbows, there is still no paint rub there either. So I was really happy with once the paint dried and how it came out. Same with when you seal it, it's really awkward, but seal each individual part. It will just set so much easier when you come to actually moving the figure around and using it once everything is dry. So yeah, after I went through all of that with sanding down the joints, finally decided I was finished with what I had, and at that point is when you can say that is the body pretty much painted. So after that, obviously Goku Black's boots are thin and round, and the shoes that become on Super Saiyan Blue Goku, the boots have, you can see the lines and the stars and the shapes and all that in them. And so what I tried to do, like kind of the best way I could, with a joint like that, I first went around cutting all the little lines off of the boots, and then with sandpaper, once I cut off as much as I could, with a fairly rough grade sandpaper, you can then sand around the boot to try and smooth it out and get the lines and the pattern of the boot off of the front so it looks straight. Again, I pretty much ended up sanding half of my thumbnail off doing so, because it takes a lot to get it looking as smooth as possible, and I kind of gave up there. I mean, it's not too bad, it could be a lot better, but at least they definitely don't look like the same boots anymore. So that's how I went about that. Once you've cut everything off and sanded them down, just paint them a flat white. Again, watered down white every time you paint, watered down. And yeah, so once you've painted them white, couple layers, the boots are good to go. And yeah, once they've been sealed and you've sealed down the legs, you can reattach them. Don't reattach them before you've sealed them, or even before the sealant is dried, because you're in danger of rubbing paint off or getting paint from the legs onto the white boots. So just wait until everything is finished, and then at the very end put it all back together. Right, I'm pretty sure the last thing to go on to is the Super Saiyan Rose, so let's get into that. And here he is. And so to do the Super Saiyan Rose hair and face, what I did is I had a pink that wasn't the right shade, but I had a with a white, mixed a white and a pink together until I was happy with it. So I didn't use a specific colour. I had a pink that wasn't right, and then just mixed a white with it until I myself was happy with what colour it was. So again, you can disassemble the Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan hair, so you just have the block piece and then the fringe, or the bangs, as my friends in the US would say, and there's the face. So my first attempt, with people saying I wanted to try doing it with a toothpick, and that did not work. I kept it kind of how it was. I first tried going for the screaming face, because that was the worst one from the bootleg. This was a guy that has half an eye missing, unfortunately. But my problem with the toothpick was every time I went to reapply, the end of the toothpick would rub the paint off that was already on there. So it ended up looking pretty heavy and not the neatest it could have been. So after I did that, with the other two heads, you can see they're looking a lot better. The one that he's actually got on at the minute is probably the best one. I ended up, after failing with the toothpick, using a very fine detail brush. So you can see it's quite thin. Once it's wet and kind of rubbed down, the point goes even thinner. But yeah, that's what I ended up using for painting the eyebrows. You can get the paint a lot thinner, and I also used that for the pupils. You can kind of just down from the eyebrow, press where you're painting the eyebrow, just press the brush in gently, and that's kind of how I created the got the pupil on there. It's obviously very tricky to paint the faces, but I was quite pleased with how these two came out, just not pleased with that one because the toothpick was a complete failure. So if I was you, use a fine detail brush. Again, should be in the equipment list at the very beginning. Thick and thin brushes, fine detail brushes, just helps the paintwork look a lot better once you've finished. And so with the actual hair, I gave them a base coat of white first to help the pink settle on there, and then with a watered down pink, just gave the hair a couple couple layers, and you don't need to do every part on the back, because again, if you do the pegs and then if you paint too much on the flat bit on the front, you're in fear of when it dries it might not fit back together properly because the paint has gone all kind of gloopy or added an extra layer to where it would usually fit together. So obviously you can see there you don't need it on the part that's hiding on the front of the hair and the front of the back part of the hair. So after I'd painted the hair, that is pretty much all of the painting finished. To then seal it, I used Mod Podge. Got a fairly big pot, poured some Mod Podge into the pot, added some water, so there's a fairly light and thin solution of Mod Podge, and yeah, use that, do it with a paintbrush, do one layer, wait for it to dry, do another layer, try not to touch it because with the sealant you'll end up getting thumbprints in it, and that's not what you want at the very end of the custom. After all of that sanding down and all of that painting, you don't want to be putting thumbprints and all that in it. But once it is pretty much all sealed, you are good to go. So you can see from mine there's been very minimal paint rub on the joints. Happy with the paintwork. The bootleg could have been better, but I am quite happy with kind of how I got this custom looking. I'll put the head back in quickly so you can see, and that is pretty much everything I went through to create this custom SH Figuarts Goku Black and Super Saiyan Rose. I will call it a day there. Thanks for watching, guys. Let me know in the comments if any of you are going to try this or use this as a guideline to customize another figure. So yeah, just hit me up in the comments and let me know. Cheers guys, thanks for watching.